and its return to the House in ultimate passage.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
I call the Honourable Member Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm happy to take a call on this Riccarton Bush Amendment Act, and I want to acknowledge the local member, Jerry Brownlee, for bringing this to the House. And I also want to acknowledge the Riccarton Bush trustees for their work who, along with the Christchurch City Council Legal Services Unit, did much work in preparing this bill that we're examining now. Now, as the member opposite has indicated, this is in the Ilam electorate. It's not in the Wigram electorate, but it is only a few metres over the boundary. And, Mr Speaker, I observe that I can see it from my window. Now, this bill tidies up the 1947 Act and the governance arrangements that were put in place for the board for the Riccarton Bush trustees, and it better defines their functions to provide for the continuation of the very good work they've been doing, and it enhances what they can do in preserving this. Labour will support this bill to Select Committee. We believe this is based on good consultation. The board has been very involved in putting together this piece of work, and local people have been consulted, and a number of Christchurch people have had their input. But we think it's really important that as Cantabrians confront their future, that it is important that we preserve our past. And Riccarton Bush and the land and the buildings that are there are an important part of that past. We think that our heritage and preserving our heritage in our city is important, and we'd like to see some of those heritage buildings left standing. Now, I'm just going to indulge the historian and myself for a few moments and get on the record some of the important history of this site, because Riccarton Bush is an incredibly important part of our natural history. It is part of a protected remnant of bush that we once saw all over the Canterbury Plains. The species and the plants that we see growing there were once what much of the plains looked like. It is now, as the member bringing this bill to the House has noted, it is now protected with a predator fence, and we see some important work in terms of the biodiversity in the Canterbury area taking place in this area. This was a site that was also important to Ngāi Tahu. This was an important Mahinga Kai site, and it was also an important timber site for the iwi. It was from the bush that much of the carving and waka were produced, and it was also an important place for gathering pigeons, and an important food source site. And I also note that Riccarton Bush was perhaps one of the first rewrapped and given back Christmas presents in Canterbury, because the Deans actually signed their deal with to buy the land with the agents of the Canterbury Association on Christmas Day in 1848. And they promptly gave half the bush over to the emerging settlement to be used as a source of timber in building the city. This is something I think that resonates with many of us in Christchurch at the moment, thinking about building and rebuilding as we go about recreating a city, that we had some settlers who had the foresight to think that their civic mind actually was to contribute to the city that was growing up around them. But actually I do note that actually by 1851 all of that timber had been gone, but the settlers had used all that had been used. The Deans, on the other hand, I think were exemplars of what we need to do in terms of preserving this bush. Theirs has actually survived. They only used timber that fell down, and actually adopted very much a conservation model in terms of their own stand of trees that they were looking after, and much of the timber was used to build Homebush. So it's just some of the history of the site. So the board, when they were looking at the legislation that was needed to enhance the governance of this area of land, identified a number of areas that needed tidied up. They said that the new Act, the amendments to the Act, and rather than repeal the Act that was in place, they elected to do this amending piece of legislation because they wanted the original Act to actually stand as a historical document itself. But they said that the amendments needed to reflect the shape of local government as it is now, and the financial planning that happens in local government as it is now. They needed to update the statutory functions of the board, and they wanted to require the board to adopt a management plan, much like a management plan that would happen under the Reserves Act. But of course, this is governed by its own Act of Parliament. But one of the significant drivers for the board in seeking these amendments was the low level of statutory levy that was payable by the local councils and what actually was happening in reality, that much of their funding was actually topped up by additional grants. So Labor welcomes this tidying up, particularly around this funding, and we welcome this particularly in light of the local government reforms that are currently going through this House. Who knows whether Riccarton Bush would be a core service under the local government reforms. But this Act gives this incredibly important historical site within our city protections and its funding, some certainty and some protections, because there's a bit of a yes-no maybe game going on with what will be regarded. V8 super races no, garden shows yes. Who knows when it comes to Riccarton Bush? So the kiwis in the trees, who knows whether they'd been seen as a core service. So we're very happy to see this go to Select Committee. As I noted at the beginning of my speech, we think that it has had good local public consultation, but we think the opportunity for more public input would be good. And we welcome many of the provisions that are in the Act. And I want to especially point to the statutory protection that expressly preserves the right of free public entry to Riccarton Bush and the lands vested in the board. And I'd like to congratulate the people that have put together this bill for having that provision in there. That is something to be acknowledged and to be congratulated. And I also note that the bill authorises the bill to own and to acquire other lands for purchase or that is gifted to it. And at the Select Committee stage, what I'd like to see considered and what we'd like to see considered is whether there could be protections against the sale of this asset. Because I do note that this bill was actually put together 4 or 5 years ago at a time when the people putting it together wouldn't have imagined the pressure that would be brought to bear on Christchurch City to sell off its assets. So we'd like, and I do note that it's the very member that has brought this bill to the House that is putting that pressure on Christchurch City to sell its assets. So we'd like to use the opportunity of Select Committee to see if there is a good opportunity to protect this most valuable asset for the people of Christchurch forever. Because I did note with some relief, actually, that the member did note that there wasn't much monetary value in Riccarton Bush, so it's obviously gone through his thinking process, but we would like to see this preserved forever in the people of Christchurch and not put at risk. And that is something Select Committee could examine to strengthen an already very strong bill that is going to do much to make sure that Riccarton Bush is at the heart of a recreated Christchurch, and it's there for generations more of Christchurch people to enjoy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Very good.
I call the Honourable Member Nikki Wagner.